Let's turn now to the meat of Volume 1 and explore the mystery of the Druids and some less known facts about this ancient priestarchy of the West. The Celtic scholar R.J. Stewart, in his book Celtic Bards, Celtic Druids, wrote, "None of the Celtic source literature is by Druids. In Ireland, the amount of poetic or Druidic material in manuscripts is substantial. The bulk of the source material is unpublished and still untranslated." Julius Caesar, this is a rather well-known entry in his memoirs or diaries or writings. In his book, The Gallic Wars, this great destroyer of Druidism, he wrote, "As one of their leading dogmas, they include this, that souls are not annihilated, but pass after death from one body to another. And they hold that by this teaching, men are much encouraged to valor, through disregarding the fear of death. They also discuss and impart to their young, many things concerning the heavenly bodies and their movements, the size of the world and our earth, natural sciences, and the influence and power of the immortal gods." So he's just corroborating what we've already been mentioning several times throughout this presentation. We're talking astrologers here. We're talking astronomers, scientists, architects, teachers, people who had not only schools of learning, but who taught the young the mysteries of nature and the mysteries of the world. I mean, this is the enemy saying this in their own work. And of colossal importance for modern theology, for modern thought, Judeo-Christianity, Caesar is saying, hey, the language and the good humour of the Celts, in the midst of whom they found themselves settled. He goes on to say that Professor E. Curry, in his book The Early Irish Manuscripts, thinks that the Ogham characters, this is one of the alphabets of ancient Ireland, so often mentioned in most ancient Irish books, were used in Erin long before the introduction of Christianity there, and he strengthens his opinion by proofs which it is difficult to contradict. Those characters are even now to be seen in some of the oldest books which have been preserved, as well as on many stone monuments, the remote antiquity of which cannot be denied. One well-authenticated fact suffices, however, to set the question at rest. It is quite certain, says Curry, that the Irish druids and poets had written books before the coming of St. Patrick in 432 AD, since we find that very statement in the ancient Gaelic tripartite life of the saint, as well as in the annotations of Tiracan, preserved in the Book of Armagh, which were taken by him from the lips and books of his tutor, Saint Mactha, who was the pupil and disciple of St. Patrick himself. What Caesar then states of the Druids, that they committed everything to memory and used no books, is not strictly true. They must have been true only with regard to their mode of teaching, in that they gave no books to their pupils, but confined themselves to an oral instruction. So Thebaud is clearly mentioning here, clearly stating that there's even the earliest accounts of the Druids are not wholly to be trusted. We're not seeing slavery. We're not seeing sacrifice. We're not seeing that they only had an oral tradition. Just visitors are being educated. The visitors are finding the people that they're invading to be more advanced than they are. He's saying that the fact that they had an oral tradition and that their writing tradition is actually stated in the earliest Arca means bear, which is a reference, of course, to the bear constellations. This implies that they were not only from northern climes, but that they were astrologers and navigators. That's right, Boreas, Arcadia. We're talking about the northern sky here. We're talking about Ursa Major and Ursa Minor. We're talking about people who took their names from the various constellations and heavenly bodies that they venerated. This is also where the word Akkadian comes from. The root Akkad means holy place. And as I've pointed out in my works on astrotheology, the holy place was nothing more than the northern sky, the original Camelot, the original Hyperborea, the original Garden of Eden. In India, Britain was referred to as Britistan, meaning the seat of religion. The seat of religion. So thousands of miles away in India, that little country of Ireland and that little country of Britain was known to be the seat of religion. Well, we've been taught that, no, wait a minute, we've been taught that India is the cradle of religion. But when you go to the Indians, the ones in the know, they're saying, oh, no, we received it from the West. Now, J. Lewis, in his book Astronomy of the Ancients, he writes, whether the origin of the zodiac is Aryan or Egyptian, it is still of immense antiquity. Simplicius, the 6th century AD, writes that he had always heard that the Egyptians had kept astronomical observations and records for at least 300 630,000 years. Diogenes Laertius carried back the astronomical calculations of the Egyptians to 48,863 years before Alexander the Great. Maritanus Capella corroborates the same by telling posterity that the Egyptians had secretly studied astronomy for over 40,000 years before they imparted their knowledge to the world. Carl Jung, commenting on the zodiac, which he studied astrology, he said, "As we all know, science began with the stars, and mankind discovered in them the dominance of the unconscious, the gods, as well as the curious psychological qualities of the zodiac, a complete projected theory of human character." And this is an immense statement from one of the greatest intellects ever to have lived. He studied the divination arts, he studied the Hermetic arts, he made a close study of astrology, and basically understood that it's not about rocks floating in space, it's something so much more profound. His comment is talking about the connections between psychic energy and material energy, between the microcosm and the macrocosm. And of course, he's a modern scientist, but are we to understand that the ancients also thought exactly as he did? That when they came up with astrology, I mean, after all, they're the creators of these incredible meta-sciences. Were they ignorant of the fact that the zodiac is a complete projected template and theory of human character? Of course they knew that. Of course they were familiar with what I refer to as the inner zodiac and the 12 divisions of the mind, 12 divisions of thinking, 12 divisions of consciousness that then by way of projection, become what we refer to nowadays as the zodiac and the 12 signs of the zodiac. W. Winwood Reade, in his book The Mystery of the Druids, he says, "It can easily be proved that the science of astronomy only look at the etymology when we're dealing with these subjects. Let's look at the numerology. Pick out the 19th card of the tarot and look what it says on that card. What is the name of the 19th card of the tarot? Why are there 19 sacred stones in a temple of the sun and a temple to the stars? Aligned, geometrically aligned to places thousands and thousands of other temple sites, microscopic temple sites in other countries. They're all networked, they're all aligned geometrically. It's not an accident. David Pinchbeck, in his book 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, says that historians and archaeologists have biased us to think of prehistoric or pre-modern cultures as societies of scarcity. This was certainly not the case in ancient Britain, as they had at the time, as well as the determination to plan and build their enormous outdoor temples, constructing from 5 to 10,000 stone circles over a 1,000-year period. Yeah, so they had the ingenuity, and they had the wherewithal, and they had the skill. Now, Bob Quinn, in a book called The Atlantean Irish, he says that in the summer of 2001, I listened to a young Newgrange guide dismissing a visitor's suggestion that the extraordinary rock designs, and these are most obviously the snake-like coils that represent the 19-year metonic cycle, have astronomical implications. He suggested that they were hallucinogenic doodles. Now let's pause here and analyze this, because this was also my own personal experience when I first started researching this particular subject on Ireland. It was about 1979, and in earnest about 1982. I think in that 1983 or 84, or possibly early 85, I went out into the field and had the misfortune of running into these Trinity University, guides who have their spiel about Newgrange and various other sites, and I was told the same thing. If you're on one of those tours, you have the misfortune to have to listen to the gibberish that these people have been scripted to read out and to say. You'll find that you dare not ask a question, you dare not point out the obvious, you dare not bring sound theories, because they're not going to reciprocate. Just in this case, where this author, who's an expert on the Celts, remarking on these stones and the etchings and the fact that they're astronomically based, or at least this visitor, he's saying that this visitor was pointing this out to the guide, only to be told, oh no, those are hallucinogenic doodles. Interestingly, that's what Barry Fell was told by very prestigious archaeologist and geologist when he pointed out to them that there was ogum, this is ancient Irish writing, stone writing, in America. Almost word for word, he was told the same thing. It's just, hey Barry, it's just hallucinogenic doodles, pay it no mind. And of course he knew that this was preposterous nonsense. Now, the Druidic order was apparently tripartite in nature. That means threefold. There were the Ovates, the Bards, and the elite Druids, like we said, the Olam, the elite Druids who presided over all. The order was not to enforce hierarchy, but to make sure that only the pure had access to sacred knowledge. As we said earlier, very important to be pure of mind when you're doing the Druidic duties, of healing the earth and healing in general. And therefore not anyone can just do that, nor should anyone be allowed to do it. So is transmogrified, becomes a soft F sound. So faith and fate. These are words that come from the Irish vate, meaning one of the Druids, a name for a Druid. This is where we get the words Veda and Vedic and Edda, the Norse Edda. And we even get the word Vatican from this. They all derive from this Irish word, the place of faith, the place of the men of faith, and so on. The word bard may derive from Boread, meaning the northern again, because these were men of the northwest. These were people who watched the northern sky. These were people of Arcadia, Hyperborea. The word bard may be the origin of the bar, when lawyers are called to the bar. And speaking in brief about their pantheon, we discover something again that was cannibalized. The chief god of the Druids was the stag god known as Cernunnos, or also Herne, H-E-R-N-E. This is then picked up further into Europe, into the east, by the Greeks, and possibly the Etruscans, you see, and we have Herm, or Hermes. The meaning of the word Hermes meaning secret, the secret one, or the keeper of the secrets, the secret tradition. Hermes, we understand that is the, in Egypt that's Thoth, and also amongst the Romans it's Mercury, the god Mercury. And look how common the symbol of Mercury is, the caduceus, and the symbol of Mercury. You find it in Piccadilly Circus, you find it on newspapers, you find it on the friezes of buildings. It's a very commonly known symbol. Well, just realize every time you see the Grecianized version of Mercury, that's based on a much more ancient god from Ireland, Herne, the stag god, the god with the antlers. And as the picture on the bottom there, bottom left, shows you, this is Pashupati. This is Shiva, one of the earliest gods known in India. Again, emphasizing the connections between the West and the East. They have the same god in the same pose, representing exactly the same concepts. In the book, Volume 1 of the Irish Origins, we go into this movement and we address this whole idea of the dispersion of the Western area. And when we see very fair children and fair people as far away as the Tarim Basin in China, we even find them in Australia and Tasmania. We certainly find the tradition in India. The girl on the left is Pakistani with blonde hair. The girl on the right, piercing blue eyes, from Afghanistan, Pakistan, India. When you go over there, you find it's very understood about these ancient traversals and ancient relationships that the modern scholars will do anything to deny. As we said, the Druids are divided. They loved and adored the number 3. They even divided their own order into 3. And that's picked up today when we have schools that divide themselves into houses. We have Congress, we have legislation, you see, we have the judiciaries. We have a lot of tripart divisions, flags, and so on. Just check out the very shape of the pyramid. Just check out the shape of Buckingham Palace. That's the image on the bottom. The image on the top right there is the Buckingham Palace seen from above. The Jewish menorah is a take on the 3. The Congress room design, occult symbols. We have broadcasting Christian networks in America. We've got corporate logos, you see. We have PBS corporations. We've got banks. Their logos tell you a story. We've got the headdress of the popes, the mitre. We've got television shows that employ the tripart division. We're going to ask where that came from. Here is a Jesuit ceremony which emphasizes the 3 initiations and matriculation in 3. Tremendous study just to look at the word 3. Now the word Druid has several probable related origins. Most likely it derives from the Gaelic Dreda, pronounced Dri or Dred, meaning kindred, or from Druvid, that means one who knows. Vid, Veda, just like we showed in a previous slide there, the Druvid, one who knows, or one who has knowledge. Now the suffix vid can also be rendered wid with a W. That's the root of the word wizard and the word wise. We find this syllable in Vedic and Veda that connote the highest wisdom. It may also derive from druthin, right? So Druid may derive from druthin, that means the servant of truth. In German, it means of God. An Irish priestess was also known as a druth, or a dri, a dre. We derive the word truth from druthin. The hard D at the beginning of the word is softened and anglicized as the letter T. So truth and druid is the same word. Druids are servants of truth. Another acceptable rendering is from the Welsh Gaelic dervid, or derwyd, meaning superior priest or inspector, and from, I guess that's pronounced draoeth, meaning magician. In Persian we have duri, meaning noble and holy man. This Dervid is very similar, of course, to the modern name David. So King David, Camp David, the term David, the name David, where did that come from? We also see, when we study Druidry, this enormous reverence for trees and the emphasis on the tree of God. In this Babylonian, Sumerian picture, we see the primal couple, a sort of Adam and Eve rendition, with a sacred tree in the center, with astrological symbols at the top, and on the far right we see the serpentine symbol, which has always been used from the darkest ages of antiquity as the hieroglyphic for the female. We see the horned helmet of the bull or goat horns and the central tree. Dudley Wright, he writes that there is a tradition amongst the Jews that the tree of knowledge was named Dar, D-A-R, and that this was supposed to be the oak, whence Dar in Irish means an oak, and also implies wisdom. This is why you'll often hear it said that, of course, the word Druid means men of the oak. Well, in a way it did, because D-A-R, Darid, or Dur, or Dar, this word meant the oak and the men of the oak. And we find this word in terms like elder, or alder, the alder tree. We find it in Derry, like the city of Derry or Dwar, and even the word door. And of course we know when we study Druidism that some of their shapes of these ancient sites are portal-like, like at Newgrange, for instance. So the Druids are the doorkeepers, the gatekeepers. But it implies a spiritual gatekeeping. Now the name Asur, meaning Osiris, comes from the Egyptian Asar, meaning sacred tree. Osiris's relationship with the ash tree suggests a Druidic connection. That's right, the very name of the god Osiris, when rendered in Egyptian as Asar, is very close to the As, which was always known as the ash tree, like Ashtaroth and Ashtarte. One of the reasons for this, not the only reason, is because from the sky, looking down, Egypt itself, the Nile, as a secondary symbol. First of all, the symbol is of the sacred river, of course, but from the air it looked like the branches of a tree. The trunk was the Nile, and as it came to the delta, it branched out and looked like a sacred tree. So Egypt, in fact, Egypt in ancient days was known as the land of the tree and the serpent. And this implies many things, and I've gone into this in other presentations. The great goddess was often shown as a tree, or standing inside a tree of nourishment. The chief goddesses of Egypt were always, just like as in Ireland, connected to the sacred tree. In my opinion, this is where the origins of the Kabbalah are, because the land of the tree and the serpent, well, as a symbol, the tree and the serpent, that's the Kabbalah. That's the ancient doctrine, the mystery school teachings, known as the Kabbalah. In my reading of ancient mythology and history and traditions, these sacred traditions, there's no doubt in my mind that the fact that it uses a symbol of a tree, however stylized, and a serpent implies that it's Aryan in origin. But we always see the sacred tree. We always see the sacred tree. The Buddha sat under the tree. Lord Krishna is always seen in proximity to the tree, just as the Scandinavian Odin was seen in connection to the tree. In Grecian images of the Muses, we find the sacred tree. And the Maya, that image on the bottom right there, shows the priest and the initiate sitting under the tree, the sacred tree. And the symbols of the tree can be found all over the media. In my work on Atlantis, of course, I point out that the DNA is a sacred tree. We find in medieval paintings of the Renaissance era, of the great masters and the pre-Renaissance artists, great emphasis on the tree. It's not just decorative, it's actually a message. In the Bible we hear about Moses meeting God at a sacred tree, or as they describe it, a burning bush. Adam and Eve at the famous tree in the Garden of Eden. What's all this tree symbolism? And in fact the cross, the symbol, however plagiarized and corrupted, of the Sun King hanging on the cross is actually an old Druidic motif of the Sun King on the cruciform tree. And one could argue that the tree is also a symbol of enlightenment, or it's a symbol of the polar axis of the earth, and so on. Here we find on the Church of Scotland is that burning bush motif. And on the right, on the flag of the Church of Scotland, you'll notice that the tree is not only blazing or burning or illuminated, but it has 3 roots. Again, the number 3 representing the Druids. On the left, the picture of the Scottish Church incorporates in the design of Vesica Pisces, and also the Knights of Malta crosses. And later on we'll be looking into that symbol. Now, earlier in the introduction, in the preview, we mentioned it's a known fact that Y and J were often interchangeable. So Judah or Judaic, their origin is with the language of the trees. Specifically, the word Jew comes from the yew tree. One of the most sacred of all trees in Druidism was the yew. The taller and thinner variety of yew, similar to the cypress, known as the Fastia Geata, grew abundantly throughout Western Ireland and was sacred to the ancient warrior queen and goddess of the Tuatha De Danann, Banva, after whom Ireland was once named. Botanists believe all other yews in the world to be descended from 2 Irish trees. County Mayo comes from the word meaning yew forest. Interestingly, the most sacred Egyptian groves, orchards, and temple precincts appear to have had these Irish yews in pride of place. According to Ralph Ellis, the yew was the Egyptians' original tree of life, and it featured prominently in Egypt's most sacred mystery school traditions and initiatory rites. It was a symbol of death and underworld rites. The oldest implements in the world, dating to over 50,000 years ago, were made of yew wood. The tree may have been considered sacred because it poisoned all animals that ate of its bark or leaves, except the stag and deer. The deer and the stag were supremely sacred, of course, to the Irish Druids. Now the yew can still frequently be found in British churchyards. Given that the yews were older than Christian churches, it follows that Christian churches and cathedrals were deliberately positioned near to the tree for symbolic purposes. A study of the yew tree serves to confirm the west to east movement of the elements of religion. The last letter of the Irish Ogham alphabet was I, and that letter was connected to the yew tree. The letter turns up as the Hebrew Yod, the first letter which we find in the name of God, Jehovah, whom Moses suggestively met at a burning bush. The word yew may be connected to the word Jew, from Yahu or Judah. So, were the Jews, the so-called Jews, originally men of the yew, that is, initiates of Druidic colleges? So the letters were interchangeable. Ayu, Yua, Judah. We need to look at the etymology, keep our minds on the history of these words, and cuts through a lot of disinformation. Then we can look at another tree which was sacred to the Druids, the rowan. Just as the word Jew derives from the word for yew tree, so does the ancient name Levi, L-E-V-I, or Levite, come from the Gaelic letter L, which was known as Louis or Lewis, and which can also be rendered Louis, L-E-W-I-S, or Louis, like in the French Louis. L, the letter L, or Lewis, as it's known in Irish, was the third letter, there's that number 3 again, of the Irish alphabet. It referred to the rowan tree that was most sacred of all the trees in Irish Druidism. Each berry of the rowan tree bears a minute pentagram. So Levi, Lewis, Louis. We already spoke of the Isle of Lewis, which was sacred to the Druids up in Scotland. Well, where does this word Lewis come from? Lourdes in France, L-O-U. Lewis. Why did Moses meet God in front of a burning tree, a burning bush? Why not at a well, you see, or some other location? Why did the editors and scriptors of the Bible insist and write this in? Because tropes, these religious traditions. We find them in the Bible, but we don't notice it. There's a tree in the Garden of Eden story. In the very book of Genesis, there's a mention of an oak tree, and the burial of all the gods are buried by the prophet under an oak tree. This is what we said earlier, symbolic language. It's metaphorical, it's mythological, it's sidereal. In the book released this year, Astrotheology, again, there's a whole chapter. In chapter 19, there's a section, a very important section, on the symbolism of the tree and how the tree was the seminal and cardinal symbol of God and also of Goddess. Tribes of Israel, and you'll find that they were a tribe set apart. They were very special. They didn't operate like the other tribes. Their banner, their flag, their insignia, and their customs, their duties were very different. They were legalistic. They were the judges of the tribes of Israel. And they were the ones that Jehovah imparted the oral tradition to. Because remember, in the Bible we talk about we hear Moses received the law, the 10 Commandments. But we also hear about a unspoken oral tradition handed down to the priests, to the Levites. And little more is ever said about that. But we find that this then becomes the backbone of Judaism. But we are not told what that law is. That becomes the foundation of the Torah and the foundation of the Talmud and the foundation of Judaic religion. And of course we surmise that it also found a home. It's also key to Christian ideas. But the very presence of a tree, the very fact that we see this, to the educated person, to the one who's done their homework, what you're dealing with here is Druidism. And in the Astrotheology book, chapter 1, we also show this. How many passages, literally we have lists and lists of passages from the Bible, from the New Testament, showing the Druidic tropes and elements and motifs that the average reader is completely unaware of. But of course, the intelligent ones of the world, as I said, They've questioned these things. They know better. They know that there's an untold story. Sigmund Freud, in his very, very important book, Moses and Monotheism, and this is a book that I deal with in Volume 2 of the Irish Origins of Civilization. We deal with Sigmund Freud and his great discoveries. He said, among the greatest riddles of Jewish prehistoric times is that concerning the antecedents of the Levites. They are said to have been derived from one of the 12 tribes of Israel, the tribe of Levi, but no tradition has ever ventured to pronounce on where that tribe originally dwelt, or what portion of the conquered country of Canaan had been allotted to it. They occupied the most important priestly positions, but yet they were distinguished from the priests. A Levite is not necessarily a priest. It is not the name of a caste. Well, we find also the city of Maliwi, or Maliwi, or Maliwi, which turns up in the Nile. The great city of Maliwi, the city of the Jews, the so-called Jews, was a city on the Nile. So we've got yew trees, we've got the tradition of the trees, we've got temple structure, the pylons are tree-like, and we've got the origin of the Jews and the Levites. And of course, if people are familiar with the work of Ralph Ellis and Mustafa Gadala and Ahmed Osman, they'll know that it's no longer a secret about the origin of the 12 tribes of Israel. The Isle of Lewis in Scotland was a Druidic centre. The place names Lewisham and Lewis derive from this root. Additionally, the supreme sun god of the ancient Irish was Lu. There it is again, L-U-G-H. He appears globally as the English Lud, and Lud, L-L-U-D, is where we get the word London. So the word London was originally Ludunum, and where St. Paul's Cathedral is, that was the ancient temple of the sun god. Now it's got a Christian cathedral on it. It was originally near the Fleet Street. A key position in London was dedicated. Luke, L-U-K-E, the patron saint of surgeons and healers. As I said, the word London comes from Ludunum, meaning Lew's Hill. Lew's temple is now the site of the Christian St. Paul's Cathedral. The rowan tree may have been given its name Lewis due to it being sacred to Lu, who connects to the tree as Odin, the Norse Odin, connected to the great world ash tree, or as Zeus was connected to the great oak tree. The duplicitous historians and clergy know that the real meaning of the title Hebrew had to be obscured. It was noted that the word was similar to apiru, which referred to thieves, wanderers, and vagabonds, or to simple shepherds seeking refuge in Egypt due to droughts. Such refugees did exist and were bound to sustain themselves in Egypt by performing menial tasks. With the letter H added, we have hapiru, making a word that could easily be mistaken for Hebrew or Hebrew. But the apiru or hapiru were not the same people as the Hebrew or Ibaru or Abaru, the wise ones and counselors man was of the company of what he called the disciples or the followers of Horus, Horus being the falcon-headed sun god, from which we get terms like hour, hours of the day, the Horus, the horizon, the great sun god of Egypt. Well, the Shamsu-Hor, here we have them again. The Shamsu-Hor are the Druids in an Egyptian context. They existed in pre-dynastic times. They were temple builders, they were astronomers and astrologers. they were teachers, and they were the ones who are the primordial Hibiru, not the Apiru, that just simply meant a visitor to your land, a refugee. And it's known by historians that there were great famines, that Egypt was the breadbasket for all people in the surrounding districts and lands, from as far away as Mesopotamia, as far away as Palestine. In times of great famine, they would all descend on Egypt, hoping to be looked after, you see. And there was also on Santorini, the eruption of Mount Thera, which has now come to light, which also caused devastation in that region. And again, Egypt, although Egypt was shaken desperately itself, Arthur Diott Thompson, in his monumental work entitled On Mankind, Their Origin and Destiny, wrote, "Hebrew, in short, is the language which enables men to pass from one meaning to another, which explains, interprets, gives the allegorical meaning. By Hebrews, therefore, Moses does not mean the Israelites, but men, Israelites or Egyptians, who were learned in the Hebrew language, in the knowledge of Ambres, the initiated and the initiators." The Reverend Robert Taylor, in his book The Devil's Pulpit, he wrote, "The initiated who had passed through all the inferior grades and attained the highest rank of autops, or eyewitnesses, were called by the whole pagan world Israelites or Hebrews. The name of Israelites, Jews, or Hebrews did never designate a political or national body, but were the name which, from an infinitely remote antiquity, designated the highest order of the initiated into the holy mysteries, and to whom alone were committed the oracles of God." Now we start to see why the works of such people as I'm mentioning was suppressed. Now we know what earth-shattering revelations come when you delve Heber, and we find out that the ancient name of Ireland was Hibernia. And this is not because that name was brought by Easterners to the West, as some scholars maintain. No, it's because that term was the word that meant the Iberu, the land of the Iberu. It was taken west. It was known throughout the whole world. And the Egyptian language confirms what we are saying about these intriguing terms. In Egyptian, the word Ibre, meaning, like the Hebrew Eber, refers to rivers and to water. The reference here was most probably to the Nile and to the schools of the Hebrew that existed along that great river. With the letter H added to the beginning of the word, we have the Eber, meaning men of the river. Rivers were always considered sacred to the ancients. The Rhine River, for instance, takes its name from the Germanic word rune, meaning sacred knowledge or source of wisdom. Men of the river, therefore, refer to those of the underground stream of hermetic knowledge. In the papyrus of Hunefer, of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, we see Osiris enthroned upon the sacred river or pool of water from which arises the papyrus plant with the 4 sons of Horus. So whether you're talking about the Indus or the Ganges or the Saraswati, you're talking about the Nile, or you're talking about the Rhine or any other river, river was always sacred. This is where a lot of communities developed. This is where the mystery schools are. This is where the temples were built. This is why the symbol of the river is found in Washington, D.C., with the obelisk and the Washington Capitol. This is why you see the river running past the rivers like the Thames, for instance. What about the Mississippi in America? So the symbol of the river is another, just like the tree, very, very important symbol. And as we said, Egypt was called the land of the tree and the serpent because they understood that their river looked like a tree. These two symbols go hand in hand. And Dr. Alfred M. Lilienthal, in his book, The Jews Are Not a Race, he wrote, the descriptive name Judaism was never heard by the Hebrews or Israelites. It appears only with Christianity. Flavius Josephus was one of the first to use the name in his recital of the war with the Romans to connote a totality of beliefs, moral commandments, religious practices, and ceremonial institutions of Galilee, which he believed superior to rival Hellenism. When the word Judaism was born, there was no longer a Hebrew Israelite state. The people who embraced the creed of Judaism were already a mix of many races and strains, and this diversification was rapidly growing. Okay, so we owe it all to historians as duplicitous and as fraudulent as Josephus Piso, Flavius Josephus Piso. Do that. When you are a Conor McDarry and you do ask these questions and you find out such a fantastic story, an alternative story of history, look what opens up. Look how many lies fall away. Earlier we mentioned that one of the most important questions regarding Atlantis, Lemuria, and the pre-Diluvian civilizations that are mentioned in the world's cultures and specifically in the mythologies and folk traditions is what happened to them. And we addressed the idea of the age of catastrophe that wrecked the world, and that we emphasized it was a global disaster, a global calamity. So let's turn now to the age of catastrophe to learn something about that period of history, of ancient history. In my work I've mentioned that the campaign to have the world believe in the east to west transit of the elements of civilization was made considerably easier since the great land bridges that once existed between Ireland and England, and between England and Scandinavia, or the continent, have long since been submerged. Well, this is a very, very important note here, because, again, we've emphasized at least 2-3 times that the world doesn't look the way it did in ancient times. That goes for the borders of different countries, it goes for the coastlines, you see, and it goes for the positioning of islands. off the edge of the world. And we laugh at that today. But this was a ploy to prevent explorers and men of wealth from funding and participating in trips that might take them to the Western Isles. And that would have then meant, of course, earlier discovery of the significance of the Western Isles. And the otherworldliness, that sense that there was something forbidding or mysterious. Ireland and England were often called the land of the gods. A lot of people believed that these lands were inhabited by strange animals and demons and so forth and so on. And this aura of otherworldliness grew up. We sense this in the various myths that deal with Avalon, or with the Lyonesse and the mysterious Lost Isles, which Celtic and Irish mythology is so full of. But you see, once upon a time, as we heard Commons Beaumont earlier mentioning, that maybe only a small estuary separated Scotland and England from Scandinavia. What happens if these land bridges, which now geologists know existed, between England and Ireland, and also between England, western coast of England, and the eastern coast of Scandinavia or the continent? What happens if it's discovered later on that there was a land bridge between southern England and France? As we said, that changes what we know about the topography. But what it also does is it makes places that are now very remote, like for instance the Shetlands, like the Isle of Lewis, like the Orkneys. Yes, they're remote and wild and desolate now, and we could never think of those places being anything to do with a cradle of civilization or a cradle of language and writing and customs. Of course not. Because this is, again, is this sort of implanted idea that we have about the topography and the geography of Europe. Corrupted with evil. So there, again, another motif. They're not just talking about physical calamity. Every time you're reading an account of this devastation, you're reading also about moral turpitude, a moral falling off, some sort of spiritual unraveling. Dudley Wright, in his book Druidism, The Ancient Faith of Britain, he says that traditions of the submersion of cities beneath the various lakes of the country are still current throughout the whole of Wales. The annotator of Camden mentions the names of no fewer than 6 lakes in which ancient cities are reported to have been submerged. From the Zuni Indians of North America, in one of their legends they say that earthquakes shook the world and rent it. Creatures turned fierce, becoming beasts of prey, wherefore others turned timid. Wretchedness and hunger abound. Black magic, war, and contention entered into the hearts of men and creatures. We've been saying from the outset here about this falling off, this moral falling off. We've also hear the legends talking about this, and the coming in of contention and corruption and wickedness. And underlying all of that, of course, is the idea of a trauma that beset consciousness. This is central to my work, and we dealt with it extensively in the Atlantis book and Atlantis DVD. What happened to man a short period of time ago? And if, in fact, some of the nightmare fears and phobias that we have, some of the what apparently appear to be psychological syndromes and complexes, fear of water, fear of dark places, fear of foreigners and strangers, fear of certain insects, all of that, all the stuff we covered in the Atlantis work. Could that be physiological? And more importantly, it's recent. It's a recent trauma. What would that do to consciousness? Has anybody ever asked this question? In the introduction of the Atlantis book, we asked that. Is anybody interested in the origins of evil? I mean, here we are, running amok. There's ecocide, there's genocide, there's megadeath, there's sadism in our own lives. The world is wall to wall with injustice, criminality, all sorts of stuff. We're working it out as we go along. Let nature take over evolution and we'll reach some sort of a, plateau of normalcy. The Christian world, the religious world always tell you that it's to do with original sin and sinning against God and all of this stuff. But can we look at it in a different way? That this earth cataclysm, this trauma, is caused by watching the earth around you dissolve and all sense of stability gone. Unimaginable horrors, unimaginable devastation. And if one goes around Britain, especially northern Scotland, to the Highlands of Scotland, to Argyllshire, if one has open eyes when they go around the Boyne Valley, or the Shannon Valley, or you go to the Aran Islands, you see, and go there with educated eyes, you will see the remnants. You'll see the evidence of the horror and the destruction that nature once wrought. But of greater interest to me than that even is the psychological consequences to mankind if the whole of mankind experienced such devastation. To me, this has not been gone into, and it deals with the coming of all of this tragedy and this moral turpitude and this wickedness. As has happened in many cities of the world during wartime, what is it automatically that people do? Almost by compulsion, almost without being told what to do. Well, they go amongst the rubble and they try to salvage anything they can. They take one brick and they put another one on top of it. It's a slow, agonizing process of restoration. Well, in ancient days, this was done. Many of the monuments and the great ancient sites that you will go to in Scandinavia or in Britain or in Scotland or whatever, mad now, going out of their minds, that ritual of lifting the stones and bringing them to a central location and putting them there. And then, of course, what's the philosophy of that? What's the after effect? That in times afterwards, that monument would be a symbol, would it not, of the cataclysm that was, as a reminder that such things can happen. And more than that, just like the pyramid in Egypt, it would be there forever as a symbol to say, and we were able to gain restoration. Those monuments were erect, and they were saying this is order returned. In Egyptian mythology, there's tremendous emphasis on the raising of what's known as the Djed pillar. And Freemasons have picked up on this idea of a pillar that is broken. If you look into medieval art, you'll see this. If you look into Masonic iconography, you'll see this. A pillar that is broken or smashed, a curtain that has been rent, a temple that has been hit by lightning. In the tarot cards, we have a card called the Tower Struck with Lightning. We have pyramids with doors that are many feet up. Could that be to prevent water from coming in? That ancient man had learned from these cataclysms to build correctly, to build pyramidically, that great cataclysms and floods would not come again. But ancient man may have been practical enough to realize, what are we going to do with our important manuscripts? What will we do with the gods, the images of the gods? What will we do with some of the sacred relics that we have should the earth again teeter? Now I wrote that the catastrophes forced the northwesterners to flee their ancestral habitats and to cross the land bridges to the continent. Moving south and east in search of shelter and food, they were welcomed as elders by every race they encountered. They were responsible for the cave paintings at Lascaux in France, and in Egypt also, and it is their descendants that are falsely believed to have been the first invaders to ancient Ireland. These descendants were, however, merely returning to the land of their forefathers after a semblance of normalcy had returned to their wrecked homelands. So this is basically what we're talking about here, is a rewriting of almost everything that's been written about anyone invading Ireland. Because invariably, the invader, the historians talk about the invasions and the comings of this group and that group to a naked land. And therefore you're bound to believe that whoever invaded came for the first time. And this is pretty much 9 out of 10 of the books written on Irish history. The land is barren, the land is naked, it's uninhabited, and it's conquered. Forced to do so because of the cataclysm, the age of catastrophe, forcing them out of their homes. These are very advanced people, as we saw earlier, technically advanced, spiritually, theologically advanced. They're welcomed, they influence, they live temporarily in caves. So this whole story about our ancestors being permanent cave dwellers is utter nonsense. But a cave is a place that you would take temporary refuge in while the world around you was in tumult. And while you're there, you might even paint on the walls. And then you might also move on, which is what we know happened. The exact same type or style of paintings that were found in Lascaux in France have also been found in Egypt. This was last year discovered, 2007. And what was more, the paintings in Egypt are dated to over 15,000 years ago, and this approximates the time of the Great Cataclysm. But most importantly, again, the rewriting of Irish history, of British history. Let us understand, put it in neon lights, put it in neon sign on Times Square. Return. Let us never entertain the idea that Ireland in primordial times was a naked land. It was inhabited from the most remotest periods. It probably was a remnant of the ancient lands, the pre-Diluvian lands of the gods. The only time it was ever deserted is during and after the age of catastrophe. And then hundreds of years, perhaps even thousands of years elapse. And when we start hearing of the historical and prehistorical migrations to Ireland of various groups, we have to understand one thing that is never mentioned in the ancient books and the accounts of these invasions and migrations. We have to understand that they were returns of the indigenous inhabitants of those lands. Once this is committed to memory, once this is absolutely understood, British and Irish history will make sense. More than that, you'll be able to make greater sense of what you read concerning these matters. Of course, the story has been preserved, but it's been preserved in the minstrel tradition, which of course is very much part of Irish culture. Music, poetry, the bardic tradition. When we listen to a song, for instance, like Stairway to Heaven, what are the lines we've heard so many times? There's a feeling I get when I look to the west, and my spirit is crying for leaving. In my thoughts I have seen rings of smoke through the trees, and I've heard the voices of those who stand looking. Oh, it makes me wonder. It really makes me wonder. And it's whispered that soon, if we all call the tune, then the piper will lead us to reason, and a new day will dawn for those who stand long, and the forests will echo with laughter. Within lines like that, within other songs, within other poems, supreme guide, instead of being lost in our shadow play and our heavens and hells and our adoration of nonsense and of an elect group who stand watching and waiting, and the spirit of these guides and adepts, you see, still exists within the land somewhere. This is very much close to the Gaelic and Irish tradition. Let's fast forward now to a controversial area of my work concerning the destruction of the Druids and the seizure of their gnosis. In Book 1 of the set of Irish Origins, there's a comment on the back. And how their ancient knowledge, which once illumined the world, has been plundered and misused by those who seek to spiritually darken the world and the minds of men. I also say that clearly it is not in the interests of the powers behind government and religion for us to realize that culture originated in Western climes and from pre-Diluvian civilizations of Atlantis and Lemuria. The desire of the Vatican mythmongers and mythographers was to falsely situate the seat of culture in the Middle East, as far away from the Atlantic zone that there were movements from the eastern lands and the southern lands to the west. We emphasized that by and large, though, those movements were returns. The descendants were returning to the ancestral home after a semblance of normality returned. But those historians who never deal with the age of cataclysm aren't going to tell you that. No, in their work, it's a naked land being visited for the first time. So we are not talking about later periods, starting, say, 600 BC and moving up to about 1,000 year AD. We're talking about 10,000 BC. We're talking about 6,000 BC. We're talking about the tsunamis and the cataclysms that forced people to flee these destroyed lands. And then we're talking about the return of their descendants. But we emphasize, you see, that the spread of the cultural elements happened in primordial times, years before official history opens its chapters. Because the people who are writing the histories are pathologically in avoidance of this. And this is why you see biblicists, for instance, preposterously stated that all creation began a mere 4,000 years BC. And Christians labored under that misapprehension for centuries. In fact, some people still believe it. It's also why in academic circles, they are little better when they insist that everything starts rolling around about 10, 11,000 years BC. Of course, truth doesn't need a maintenance, but a lie mechanism certainly does. So if you keep your eyes open, you'll find out that these archaeologists and these ethnologists and geologists and whatnot and scientists are forever revamping what they say they know. There's nothing consistent because everything they know flies in the face of the actual facts about what has been going on in this world. But as I mentioned in the introduction, in order to track and understand the destruction of the Druids, this phenomena that's just been a footnote of most history books, we actually have to go to Egypt. He's commonly known as Akhenaton or Akhenaten, and he was the pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, the latter part of the 18th dynasty, from about 1353 to 1336 BC approximately. And these dates are forever being modified by Egyptologists. Akhenaten was referred to as the leper or broken king, and he was subsequently exiled from Egypt during approximately the 17th year of his regency. He was the head of what is known as the Atonists, after the god that he worshipped, Aton. And Akhenaten, his family, his ministers, their gang, so to speak, the Atonists, they were rivals of another very important group that we need to know about. It's essential to study this when we're looking at Egypt. A group known as the Amonists, who worshipped the god Amen or Amen-Ra. And my work always emphasizes that the Ammonists of Egypt were in league with, were confederates of, were colleagues with the Shamsu-Hor, the disciples of Horus, who are nothing more than the Druids, the Irish Druids situated in the east. And we heard about their presence earlier on in Libya, Mali, Egypt, in pre-dynastic Egypt, in Nubia, in Sudan. All of this information has been suppressed, and you need to know about it. And what you need to know about is that there was a factionalism, there was rival dynasties. There was the Pharaoh of the north and there was the Pharaoh of the south. There were those who worshipped Aton and there was those who worshipped Amen-Ra. We have these schisms and they're important to know about. It's also important to understand that an Atonist is ultimately a member of the solar cult. It's also important to understand that the Ammonists were members of the solar cult, because there's nothing negative about sun worship or solarism or solar cultism or the stellar cult. What I address in my work is a specific corrupted version of solar cultism. But again, what we find when we turn to books and to the internet and to other writers and so-called experts is we find a wholesale damning, a wholesale indictment of solar cultism. But Christianity and Judaism is a form of solar cultism. Solar cultism is quite a large tree. And just because one branch or one twig turns out to be rotten, one shouldn't implicate the whole of solar cultism with that. Again, we have to be specific. We have to be specific when we're looking at the symbols. We'll deal with that a little bit later. But it all originates with these ancient cults of the world. Those are dealt with in my book on astrotheology and also in the DVD of the same name. We talk about the 4 cults: solar, stellar, lunar, Saturnian, and some other cults like the volcano cult and the fire cult and the Dionysian cult and the cult of Venus and so on. Now, when we talk about the Dionysian cult, we're talking drugs there. We're talking pharmacopoeia. And this plays a large role in the modern religions. One only has to look, again, with eyes that are trained in pattern recognition and symbolic literacy. Why do the clergy, why do the cardinals and the bishops and the prelates wear the colors that they do? Is there a story being told there? What is the origin of the cross? What is the origin of the mitre and the headgear? Here's some pictures from gnosticmedia.org, which show that many of the costumes and the tunics and the garb, not just of the royals, but specifically of the cardinals and the prelates and the popes, was taken from this drug cult, this ancient cult of the mushrooms. And scholars such as James Arthur and Jordan Maxwell, and more earlier we have the great John Allegro, have written books on this. Here we have the Amanita muscara mushroom, which is uncannily similar to the costumes of the prelates. Some have argued that the Holy Grail, the chalice of the Grail, is also a metaphor for the Dionysian cult of mushrooms. Here in this artwork, medieval artwork, which I believe shows the Emperor Constantine, a bizarre looking image if ever we saw one, we find again in subliminal form the mushroom. We see that Constantine is making the sign of the goat, the horns of the goat, which is an old Irish salute. Here again on the left, Christian artwork. On the bottom, the mount, the sacred mountain, the sacred hill, and on top of it the triform tree with mushroom-shaped vegetable growing there. Here in India, various images of the Buddha. Clearly and distinctly you can see the mushroom shapes there of how important psilocybin was to the ancients, that there was a whole cult operating in the ancient world. And through the work of John Allegro and others, we now have to accept that this existed. Well, there were many cults. And it's ludicrous to believe that any of the descendants of these cults, either biological descendants or ideological descendants, aren't around anymore. As Jordan Maxwell and others have pointed out, these descendants still exist and they still run the show. So we had Akhenaten, the very famous pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, and of course we have his son, allegedly his son, the very famous, equally famous Tutankhamun, or Tutankhaten as he was called, because at once, when he was an Atenist, he had the term of Aton, his god, in his name. He's the son of Akhenaten and the queen Kia. Akhenaten had 2 wives, Nefertiti and Kia, and after his father was deposed and exiled, Tutankhamun, or Tutankhaten, changed his name to Tutankhamen because he had returned to the worship of Amen, and he turned everything that Akhenaten did, he tried to turn it back to the way it was. salvation was funded by the Rothschild dynasty, to which he was personally related. Investigators Mustafa Gaddala and Ahmed Osman, like Sigmund Freud had, speculate that Tutankhamun is the actual prototype for the Jesus Christ of the Bible. You have to understand what prototype means. It doesn't mean he was Jesus of the Bible, but many of the characters that turn up in later texts, just as they turn up in history or mythology, are based on very rendering of the original Egyptian syllable or term. Those terms, of course, were in hieroglyphics. So in one way you can understand it, because the translation of certain hieroglyphics has always been problematic. There hasn't really been more than about 1,500 words discovered in Egyptian. And sometimes the vowels and consonants, different scholars are ambivalent about the translations. But Gaddala is adamant that in the case of TUT, you see, it's far better to render that DWD or even DVD. And of course, if you do that, then what we find as the first syllable of the name of Tutankhamun is actually Dawood or David. This is the origin of the word David that we looked briefly at earlier on in the presentation about Camp David, you see, and David, King David. Well, it turns out that that's an Egyptian name, or more correctly, a title. And TUT, that rendition, that transposition is inaccurate, and it maybe was inaccurate on purpose. We have to understand that there's also a method to this madness. The title David has been found to refer to the kings of the Egyptian 18th dynasty, that is, to the cult of Aton. In other words, there was not one David, but many. The word had a similar meaning to general, field marshal, or commander. Well, we have not only Tutankhamun, remember, we have Tuthmosis, and there was at least 3 of them. In fact, there was about 4 Tuthmosises. So the Tuth is much better rendered as the David or the David. And this was a term, a title, not a personal name. More, it should be reckoned as a title. We also derive the word dove, D-O-V-E, from the word David. We also have the word divide, hinting at sacred geometry and the whole science of geomancy and architecture. The dividers, those who are expert at architecture. And this, of course, brings in a Masonic angle as well. So we derive the word dove from David, and the white dove is frequently used as a cryptic insignia for the house or seed of David, and therefore for the cult of Aton. It's Latin. In Latin, dove is columba, and this, of course, gives us the Knights of Columbus and Saint Columba, etc. There on the picture you can see the doves on the maces and standards of the British royals, the Davids, the Atonists. We said that the wife of Akhenaten was Queen Kia, but the most famous wife of Akhenaten, of course, was Queen Nefertiti, who lived approximately 1370 to 1330 BC. We speculate, given some evidence, that she might have been an Irish or even Scythian princess. Perhaps that's true. In any case, she lost favor with Akhenaten, and Egyptologists are suggestively vague as to the reason. She can be identified as the prototype for Mary of the Bible, and she bore 6 daughters to Akhenaten. Dr. Joanne Fletcher, in her book The Search for Nefertiti, she said her Aryan looks made her particularly attractive to the Führer, and this description was also applied to some of the amazing life-like plaster casts, masks. In 1927, the keeper of the Egyptian antiquities at the British Museum described one of them as being not that of an Egyptian nor a Semite. It is that of a northerner. It is a Nordic type. So the pale, famous aquiline features of the great Queen Nefertiti, the wife of Tutankhamun, the wife of Akhenaten, betrays the fact that she may not have been Egyptian, but she was certainly royalty, because in fact Akhenaten had to marry with her in order to gain title, in order to become the pharaoh. So she was an elite. She was somebody of aristocratic background. But evidence shows that she may not have been from Egypt. She may have been one of these descendants of the Shamsu Hor. Graham Phillips, in his book Act of God, says that Nefertiti's name, "A beautiful woman comes," does not contain the noble designation normally found in the birth names of high-ranking Egyptians. This unconventional designation, coupled with the complete absence of family history, suggests that Nefertiti may not have been a native Egyptian. An important indication that Nefertiti was indeed of foreign extraction is the bust in the Berlin Museum. The fair-skinned woman it depicts is clearly not of North African origin, but markedly European. Is that why the scholars are vague about her ancestry and also what happened to her in the latter part of Akhenaten's reign? Is that on purpose? Have they buried the information because of what it might imply if it is indeed found out that this Nefertiti, the great queen of Egypt, her ancestry is to be found amongst the Scythians of Europe, or the Irish of Britain? Now the pharaoh, as I said, became king by marriage to the right queen, the queen with the legal title. As Mustafa Gadala points out in his book Historical Deception, the Egyptian women were entrusted with the civilization. The woman, or the princess, and not the male, was the legal heir to the throne, and the man she chose to marry would become the ruling pharaoh. Now Aton, the rites and rituals. And the symbol of the lion, of course, is ubiquitous. It's another one that we see without observing. We see it not only on Judaic symbolism, but we see it in Britain, we see it in media corporations, and we see it on heraldry. It also turns up on the coronation chair of the kings and queens of England. This chair, of course, was originally in Ireland. It went by way of Scotland, I believe, and then it's finally, at the time of the Stuarts, turned up in England. But the central point of interest is that it is sitting on, it is propped up upon 4 lions, the symbol of the Atonists, the solar cult. And the back of the chair is again suggestively shaped like a pyramid. Now, one of the greatest controversies, one of the greatest questions surrounding the Pharaoh Akhenaten, which has been posed by people as eminent as Sigmund Freud, but which has also been a study of Ahmed Osman and Ralph Ellis and Mustafa Gadala and a few other scholars, is the whole question of whether the Pharaoh Akhenaten was in fact Moses of the Bible. Osman says An examination of their respective religious beliefs makes it clear that Moses and Akhenaten should not be looked upon, as has largely been the case, as rivals, but as the same person. The great scholar Godfrey Higgins said that Manetho, the historian Manetho, states that Moses received his priestly education and learned all the wisdom of the Egyptians in the city of Heliopolis, in the Delta, the biblical city of On, the house of the sun. This is just one of the many intriguing anecdotes that has led scholars to believe that there's a connection between these two. We talked about Nefertiti being the prototype of Mary. We talked about Tutankhamun being a very likely prototype for the Jesus of the Bible. And this has been an ongoing question, an ongoing search to discover if there's legitimate connections between the Moses of the Old Testament, the leader of the Judites, and this Pharaoh Akhenaten. Emanuel Velikovsky has looked into this. As I said, Sigmund paralleled events in the life of Tutankhamun. And in those years, the early part of the 20th century, this kind of information was highly taboo, and concerns did not want this to become widely known. But what about Sigmund Freud? What about this man's courage and bravery? No consideration, he said, will move me to set aside truth in favor of supposed national interests. Well, Freud was a Jew. He was warned by his Jewish friends to shut up. Rabbis, close friends of his, begged him to never publish Moses and monotheism. In fact, as Gerald O'Farrell shows in his book, Freud's writings, his archive, which is in New York, is almost impenetrable. It's in a lockdown situation, very hard to access. Temples were closed, and the worship of other gods was forbidden, and the people took this very hard. For about 17 years they had to endure this man's personal tyranny and the usurpation of other gods in favor of only one God. So as soon as we hear about monotheism entering the world, we also hear about cruelty and bloodshed and suppression. Is it any accident that the same thing has been going on down through the centuries? Sigmund Freud wrote, "The Aton religion had not appealed to the people. It had probably been limited to a small circle around Akhenaten's person." Lady Queensborough, in the book Occult Theocracy, she wrote, "In spite of the loud and frequent assertions made by Jews and Christian divines alike, contending that the Jews were the first monotheists, it is a well-proven fact that the high initiates of the Memphis priesthood were monotheists long before the Jews ever went to Egypt. Douglas Reed, in Controversy of Zion, the one God, he says, was mentioned in Egypt 2,600 years prior to Judaic monotheism. Of course, a study of Egyptian texts conclusively proves this to be true. From the Book of the Dead, that's almost 3,000 years BC, it says, "Thou art the one, the God from the very beginnings of time, the heir of immortality, self-produced and self-born. Thou didst create the earth and make man." From the hymn to Amun-Ra, "Homage to thee, O Amun-Ra, Lord of Thebes, thou joy, the ornament of the gods. All men lift up their faces to gaze upon him. Thou art the Lord, inspiring awe, crushing those who would revolt against thee. Thou art the King of all the gods. Thou art the great God, the living one. Thou art beloved for thy words, which are the satisfaction of the gods. Thou art the King of heaven. Thou didst make the stars." So in the ancient Egyptian chronicles, even though we hear mention of other gods, there's the overarching solar deity. There's the mention of the one all-important God. Very kindred to what we would understand between monotheism. Because if you read closely into the Bible, there's also acceptance of the other gods. And that Jehovah, or Yahweh, the God of the Christians and the Jews, was selected from a whole pantheon of different deities and gods. From the short hymn to the Aten, we read, "When you dawn, their eyes observe you. As your rays light the whole earth, every heart acclaims your sight, when you are risen as their Lord." Leonard Slane, in his fine book entitled "The Alphabet versus the Goddess," speaks of Akhenaten. He says, Akhenaten inherited the throne on a fluke of genetic roulette. Sickly as a child and disfigured as an adult, he held court with his beautiful wife Nefertiti. His two passions were reforming Egypt's religion and its writing system. Immanuel Velikovsky, in his book on Akhenaten, entitled Oedipus and Akhenaten, wrote, "Akhenaten was a stranger to Thebes. Of Yuya and Tuya, parents of Queen Tai. There were mortuary gifts from the king and queen and their daughters, but none from Akhenaten. Even the mere existence of Akhenaten is nowhere hinted at during the reign of his father. The Egyptologist E.A. Wallace Budge wrote, "The religious revolution, inaugurated by Amenhotep III at the insistence of his wife, Queen Tai, and was certainly carried on with increasing vigor by their son, Amenhotep IV, who believed that he was an incarnation of Aton." his identity. But before the 17th year of his reign, before he was finally exiled and dealt with, he unleashed a reign of terror never seen in the history of Egypt, before or after his time. Lorraine Evans again, in Kingdom of the Ark, she wrote, "So Akhenaten drifted from the position of great charismatic leader into one of despotic dictator, as many leaders have both before and since. It was to cause great strife within his people later, but for now he lived in an ideal never-never land of his own construction, isolated from the population and surrounded by family and courtiers. Now Aaron drifted into fantasies of the perfect world in which he lived and the perfect kingdom over which he ruled. Little by little, he ordered the palace artists to display him in divine form. Here was Akhenaten in the form of a divine being, the form of a messenger from the cosmos." Lorraine Evans speculates not that Akhenaten was Moses, but that Akhenaten was Aaron, who of course was an aide, a close associate of the biblical Moses. But leaving that aside, she also points out that the man was completely crazed, may have been disturbed, mentally disturbed in some way.